She didn't come with a name, she didn't ask for one either. He bought her with a sack of nails, the kind that hold walls together, not people. The town watched, judged, laughed, but she didn't leave. She stayed when the wind tore roofs apart. She stayed when the sheriff disappeared. She stayed when no one else did, and while everyone else shouted orders and made promises, she built, she mended, she listened. Some said she was simple, some said she was broken. But in the end, the only thing that didn't fall apart was the part she touched. This is not a love story. It's not a war story. It's a story about nails and hands, and the silent girl who held a broken town together. Chapter 1, The Sack of Nails. Where value meant nothing, and silence meant everything. The market smelled of rust, smoke, and something heavier, resignation. People didn't speak much here. They bartered, glanced, nodded. Words were often more dangerous than coins. And at the edge of the square, beside a rotting fence and a crooked post, stood a girl with no name and no price tag, just a number carved into the wood behind her. She was small, but not fragile, covered in dust, sunburnt and barefoot. Her hair had been chopped bluntly, uneven, like someone had done it without curor, maybe in a hurry, but her eyes, a muted storm gray, held a stillness that made people look away after a few seconds too long. The man arrived just after noon, not dressed like a buyer. He wore no badge, no spurs, and his boots were coated in dry mud. He carried a burlap sack over his shoulder, heavy with the sound of clinking metal. Nails, some new, most bent or rusted, things no one traded for, things most threw away. He walked past oxen and oil lamps, past rifles and whiskey. He didn't stop until he stood in front of her. No words were exchanged. Not between them, not with the broker either. The man simply untied the sack, set it down at the broker's feet, and looked once toward the girl. The broker blinked. "That's not payment," he said, more out of habit than protest. But the girl had already stepped forward. She didn't wait to be told, didn't look back, didn't flinch. She just walked. The man turned, and she followed. The sound of nails spilling inside the sack was the only thing that marked her departure from that place. The walk to the edge of town was long, dry, and uneventful. He didn't offer water. She didn't ask. They didn't exchange names. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't explain why he chose her. Maybe he didn't know either. But when they reached the fork in the road where wild brush met the broken trail, she paused for a second, not to rest, but to look at the hills, the open sky, and then at him. He glanced over his shoulder and met her eyes, just for a moment. And in that sliver of silence, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, not understanding, not quite, but something, like stillness, a shared stillness. That night, they camped beneath a sky bruised by the last red of sunset. He built the fire. She gathered kindling without being asked. When it burned low, she sat just far enough not to disturb him, and close enough not to be left alone. He offered no blanket. She didn't expect one. He slept with his back to her. She didn't sleep at all. It was a quiet beginning, born not from kindness, not from choice, but from something colder, necessity, maybe survival, perhaps. But as the fire died and the stars took their shift overhead, two strangers breathed in the same rhythm, miles from where value was measured in gold, in cattle, or in skin. And neither of them spoke a word. Chapter 2, The Town with Broken Bones. She arrived in a place that needed more fixing than she did. The road bent downward into the valley like a tired spine, and nestled in its hollow was a town held together by habit more than hope. Its rooftops slanted like they'd given up on holding rain. Walls were patched with mismatched wood, as if each board had a different memory. The main road was less a street and more a trail of forgotten intentions, mud swallowing wheel marks, and weeds growing where stone once was. No one welcomed them. No one looked directly at her. And yet, she felt all their eyes. They passed a church with half its bell tower missing, and a saloon with windows boarded from the inside. A child watched from behind a cracked curtain. An old man leaned against a cane outside the general store but never lifted his head. The man, her buyer, her stranger, led the way without speaking. He walked with purpose, but not pride. This wasn't a triumphant return. It was a quiet resignation. When they reached the house, if it could still be called, it sat crooked at the edge of town like it was ashamed to stand upright. Corner of the roof had collapsed. The porch sagged like a tired eyelid, and the door leaned more than it latched. A windmill nearby spun half-heartedly, groaning as if it too had things it couldn't say. She stood still for a long time, not out of shock, not fear, but familiarity. Something in the brokenness mirrored her, the gaps, the bruises, the silence. He opened the door and stepped aside. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask whose bed it had been, didn't wonder who had sat in the worn chair near the cold stove. She simply walked through the house the way someone moves through their own thoughts, slow, cautious, but not lost. The walls inside bore scratch marks, not from animals, from time. Wallpaper peeled like sunburnt skin. Dust lay undisturbed in places fingers hadn't reached in years. And yet, there was a coat hung by the door, a cup on the table, boots near the hearth. It wasn't abandoned, just forgotten. That night, he didn't sleep in the bed. He took the chair, hat over his face, rifle nearby. She made a corner her own with a blanket too thin for warmth, but not for comfort. And still, no words passed. She woke once to the sound of wind dragging loose shingles across the roof. The sound didn't startle her, it comforted her. The house breathed like she did, wounded, restless, but still here. In the days that followed, she explored quietly, one step at a time. Her fingers brushed cracked window pane. Her eyes studied rusted hinges, bent nails, missing floorboards. She didn't touch anything yet. She only watched, and the town watched her, not openly, but through curtains, whispers, and silences. They didn't ask who she was. Maybe they thought they already knew. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they were just too tired to care. But she saw them. She saw the stoop where no one sat anymore. The broken fence where children once tied string. The bridge, missing 3 planks and a memory. This town was not cruel. Just broken, like a hand that once held too tight and now didn't know how to hold it all. And somehow, without knowing why, she understood it. Because long before she had learned to speak, she had learned how to see. And this place felt like looking in a mirror that no longer judged. Chapter 3. The first nail she drove. Not in wood. In trust. It was early when she stepped outside. The kind of morning where the sky hadn't made up its mind about being blue or gray. The air carried the bite of old frost, the kind that clung even after winter had supposedly passed. In one hand, she held a crooked nail, in the other, a hammer with a splintered handle. It wasn't much, but it was hers now. The hinge had been loose since the day she arrived. The back door, more suggestion than structure, swung whenever the wind wanted to remind the house that it wasn't done breaking things. Each time it slammed, the sound cut the silence like a blade. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked to the door, knelt by the frame, and set the nail against the wood. Her fingers, stained with dirt and ash, held it steady. Her grip was neither tentative nor rushed, just sure, measured, present. The first strike was soft, more of a whisper than a command. The second landed with purpose. Inside, the man, her buyer, her silent shadow, paused mid-step. He didn't come out, but he listened. Across the street, an old woman turned her head slightly. She didn't pull the curtain aside. She didn't need to. 2 boys, barefoot and dusty, stopped tossing pebbles into a ditch and stared across the way. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm echoed in a town that hadn't heard the sound of building in longer than most could remember. It wasn't the noise that startled them. It was the intent. No one fixed things here anymore. They patched, they propped, they pretended. But repair was different. Repair meant choosing to stay, meant caring enough to fight decay, meant planting something in ground that everyone else had walked away from. When the nail disappeared into the wood, she didn't smile. She didn't look for approval. She just ran her fingers along the hinge, testing its strength. It held. For the first time in years, the door didn't slam when the breeze passed. She rose, dusted off her hands, and walked back inside. No applause, no thanks. But in a town like this, silence wasn't absence, it was observation. Later that day, the man replaced the broken handle on the drawer in the kitchen. He didn't say why. The next morning, someone stacked 2 new boards by the edge of the porch. No note, no knock. By the end of the week, the boys by the ditch had hammered a loose plank on the footbridge near the saloon, badly crooked, but still nailed in. She didn't know any of their names. They didn't know hers, but they had seen her. And more importantly, they had seen what she chose to do with her hands. Because there's a kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice, a kind of presence that doesn't need to be announced. She wasn't trying to change the town. She wasn't trying to belong. She just didn't want the door to slam anymore. And in that one simple act, she drove more than a nail. She drove a question into every wall that had given up. If she can fix something, why can't I? Chapter 4. The wall that didn't fall. She fixed it before anyone asked. The storm didn't come with thunder, it came with weight. Clouds sagged heavy and low, like old grief hanging just above the rooftops. Most of the town shut their doors before the first drop even fell. They'd seen this kind of weather before. It didn't shout, but it destroyed. And there, on the edge of town, stood the old schoolhouse, or what was left of it. The roof had been leaning for years, the south wall buckling inward like it had forgotten how to stand. Kids didn't go there anymore. They passed it on their way to nowhere, throwing stones at the broken bell or sneaking in to scrawl names on the faded blackboard. Adults walked by without looking. It wasn't abandonment, it was avoidance, but she saw it that morning. As the wind began to moan and the sky turned the color of bruises, she walked toward the building, not away from it. No one asked her, no one told her. She just went. The man watched from the porch. He didn't stop her. He didn't follow. But his fingers curled tightly around the coffee mug in his hand, knuckles white. She hadn't said where she was going. She never did. She simply looked at the horizon and knew something needed her. Inside the schoolhouse, dust lay like snow. The air tasted of splinters and mold. She ran her fingers along the wall that trembled with each gust of wind. It would fall. Not today. Not if she had anything to say about it. She didn't bring plans. She brought her hands. Didn't bring blueprints. Brought instinct. One by one, she scavenged boards from collapsed sheds, nails from forgotten crates, tools left to rust behind the general store. She hauled them in silence, through mud and rain, and when the real wind came sharp, unforgiving, she was already inside, racing the wall with her back, hammer swinging steady like a heartbeat. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but the wall held by sunset. The rain had carved rivers through the dirt roads, but the school still stood. When she stepped out, soaked and streaked with mud, a few people had gathered at a distance, not close enough to help, just close enough to witness. They didn't clap, they didn't speak, they just stared at her, this girl no one had chosen, no one had asked for, and no one quite knew. And yet, she had saved something, not because it was hers, not because anyone would thank her, but because something broken had needed a pair of hands, and hers were open. That night, back at the house, the man placed a fresh towel by the fire. She didn't take it, but she sat closer than she used to. They shared the warmth without words. Later that week, a young boy placed a basket of nails on the school's front step. A girl drew a flower in chalk on the side of the building, and an old man left a plank of fresh-cut cedar by the fence with no name attached. She didn't call herself anything, but the town was starting to, not aloud, not yet, but in the things they fixed after watching her. And the wall she saved. It wasn't just wood anymore. It was proof that when no one else stands, you still can. That some people hold the roof up just by being willing. That you don't need to be asked to be the reason something doesn't fall. Chapter 5. The boy with the broken leg. And the girl who carried him home. It was a late afternoon, soaked in golden light. The kind that made even the cracked buildings look warm. Birds hovered low. And somewhere in the woods, a branch cracked in a way no branch should. The boy hadn't meant to go far. He was chasing a squirrel, then chasing the silence it left behind. One slip on wet moss, a tumbling fall, and silence found him instead this time, in the form of pain sharp enough to take the air from his lungs. He cried, not loud, but enough. Enough for the trees to hear, enough for the girl, who was walking near the tree line with a hammer in her hand and her hair tied with a piece of twine, to pause. She didn't rush. She didn't shout his name. She didn't know it. She simply listened, tilted her head, and started walking. By the time she found him, the boy's tears had dried into streaks on his cheeks. His leg bent where it shouldn't. He saw her and tried to be brave. But she knelt beside him, soft and steady, and something in her stillness made it safe to cry again. She didn't speak, just looked at the break, then at the boy. Then she slipped off her coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. And without a word, she lifted him, not with struggle, not with sound, but with a kind of strength that only ever comes from somewhere, deeper than muscle, somewhere rooted in choice. She carried him, through trees that grumbled and groaned, over streams that bit at her boots, down paths that shifted with loose stones and memory. The boy clung to her silently. eyes wide, not from pain anymore, but from awe. No one had ever carried him before. The sun was nearly gone when they reached the edge of the town, and suddenly, voices shouting, frantic, fragmented. There he is, Milo. People ran, mothers, fathers, a healer, but they all stopped when they saw Hertha's girl, whose name they still didn't know, walking out of the woods like some silent revenant, a small boy held gently in her arms. She didn't wait to be thanked. She laid him on a blanket someone had spread on the grass, straightened, looked around once, met no one's eyes, then turned to leave. But this time, someone followed, not to stop her, just to walk beside her. And that was the first change. That night, in the lamplight of stitched windows, women gathered in kitchens and whispered not just about the boy, but about her, not the way they used to. Not in suspicion, but in pause. She didn't hesitate. She knew what to do. She didn't even ask for help. She carried him like she loved him. Something had shifted. The girl had not spoken a word, but she had said everything. And the next morning, the man found fresh bread on their porch, not because someone pitied them, but because now, the town knew who she was, not by name, but by action, by kindness, by the strength of a girl who walked out of the woods, carrying the weight of a broken limb and the town's buried disbelief, and left them both on the ground. Chapter 6. The day the roof collapsed. She didn't scream. She rebuilt. It happened just after dawn, when the fog was still curled low, like a sleeping dog, and the air held that early cold that made you believe nothing bad would happen before noon. But the roof didn't believe in timing. It gave out with a groan first, long and aching like wood, confessing something it had kept hidden for years. Then came the crash, loud and sudden, a sound that shook the birds from the wires and sent dust rolling through the cracked front door like a warning. The man was out back splitting kindling. The girl had just set a kettle on the fire, and in the space between breath and collapse, the old roof, already tired from winters, rain, and regret, fell in on itself. The fire went out, the kettle disappeared, but she stood still, a thin line of soot running down her cheek like an accidental tear. She didn't scream, didn't call for help, didn't even flinch. She picked up a board. It was splintered, the nail still halfway through. She pulled it free with both hands and turned toward the wreckage. Not like someone panicking, like someone beginning. By the time the man got there, eyes wild, axe still in hand, she was already inside the broken ribs of the house, shifting debris with a rhythm that made the ruin feel manageable, like it hadn't won. She had no blueprint, no words, just hands, calloused now, and eyes that didn't wander. One by one, she dragged out the pieces, roof beams, shattered chairs, bent door frames, all of it, out into the sun. And it was the sun that brought him Martin, the carpenter. No one liked much, because he never said much unless it was to complain. But even Martin knew the difference between noise and need. He stood there for a while, chewing the inside of his cheek, watching her move with deliberate grace, like she wasn't just rebuilding the roof, but setting something straight inside her. Then, without being asked, he walked to his shed, came back with a hammer, and handed it to her like he was handing over something heavier than steel. She nodded, just once. He nodded back. And that was the first nail they drove together. Others followed, not because they were told, but because the image of her, hair coated in ash and arms covered in sweat, was louder than any call to action. A woman brought fresh nails in a tin. A boy carried shingles in his small hands. Someone laid out lemonade on a barrel and forgot to charge for it by noon. The collapsed house looked like a hive of bodies, moving tools, clinking, wood being passed hand to hand, like a language that didn't require vowels. She led with her silence, but her silence wasn't empty. It was direction. It was assurance. It was a roof being born again, beam, by a girl who had once been bought for a sack of nails, and now used nails to hold something bigger than a ceiling. She didn't ask them to help, but when the last board was set, the chimney still standing like a scar that refused to be hidden, she stepped back and wiped her hands on her skirt. She didn't smile, but she also didn't stop anyone from clapping. Later, the man would sit beside her on the edge of the new porch and whisper, "They followed you." And though she said nothing, she picked up a nail left behind on the step and tucked it into her pocket like it was proof that something had held. Not just the roof, but the town, and maybe even her. Chapter 7. The men who wanted her back. They didn't understand. She already belonged somewhere. They came on horses, dusty, mean-eyed, sharp with the kind of arrogance that comes from thinking a person is a possession. 3 men, boots still, crusted with the road behind them, rode into town like they owned it Torwers, like they had come to collect a debt. They didn't speak at first, just looked around, faces hard with memory. One of them spat, one of them smiled, the kind of smile that had never meant safety. The third said her name, not the name she went by now, not the quiet word people here used when referring to her, but the one she hadn't heard in months. The one that came from a time before. She was in the square when it happened. Hammer in hand, shirt sleeves rolled, fixing a window that no one had asked her to fix. The townspeople had grown used to that, her quiet repairs, her way of making things whole again without asking permission. But the moment that name was shouted, everything paused, the hammer still, the breeze slowed, eyes lifted from tasks. She didn't run. Instead, she turned, and they saw it, the difference. She was taller now, not in height, but in bearing. She didn't flinch, didn't fold inward like she used to. And most of all, she didn't walk alone anymore. The blacksmith leaned on his post. The boy with the mended leg stepped to the side, just enough to be near her. A woman from the bakery came out and stood, arms crossed, flour still dusting her apron. No one said a word, but in their silence was thunder. The 3 men dismounted, confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to shrink, to obey, to remember her place, but they didn't realize she had a new place now. And it was here, when one of them stepped forward, reaching for her arm. Someone coughed, just once, sharp, and then came the sound of a hammer tapping wood. Not a threat, just a reminder. She didn't move, didn't speak, but something in her stance, in the way her shoulders squared against the wind, told them more than any scream could. You can't take what doesn't want to be taken, the man who had once bought her said, stepping beside her. His voice was calm, low, but final. The men looked around, counted eyes, counted backs that refused to turn away, and slowly, reluctantly, they realized she was already claimed, not owned, not held, but rooted, accepted, believed in. They left, eventually, with more silence than they arrived, and as the last hoofbeat faded down the road, she exhaled, not in fear, but in knowing. For the first time, she hadn't been protected by force, she'd been protected by presence, by people, by place. She didn't belong to them anymore. She belonged here, and the town, in its quiet, broken, rebuilt way, belonged to her too. Chapter 8. The house with her name on it. No one gave her a name, so she carved one into the door. It happened quietly, like most things she did. The town had begun to breathe easier in her presence. Walls mended, roofs patched, the scent of bread stronger since she fixed the bakery's oven. But still, no one asked her name. She had been called the girl, the quiet one, her, or simply you. Even the children, who loved her most, called her with whistles or tugged her sleeve. No one meant disrespect. They just didn't know what to call her. She had arrived nameless, and no one wanted to give her one she didn't choose. But that night, under a moon that looked like it too had seen better days, she sat by the door with a scrap of pine in her lap and a small carving knife in her hand. The house was still. The town was still, and she carved, letter by letter, slow, careful, a name no one had spoken but one she had carried. She didn't rush, she didn't crush, she didn't cry. She just breathed it into wood the way others might breathe it into birth certificates or wedding vows. By morning, there was a new sign nailed to the front of the house. It wasn't large, it wasn't polished, but it was steady, handmade, and it was hers. It said Mara. No one asked what it meant, no one questioned if it was real. They simply read it, paused, and nodded. That afternoon, someone from the mill brought her a better hammer. A woman at the tailor's left a red ribbon tied to her fence. The blacksmith began calling her Mara out loud, testing the sound like metal on anvil. It stuck. That it wasn't just a name anymore. It was a declaration. This house was hers. This place knew her. This town, once full of brokenness and empty labels, now had one more thing that felt certain. She had repaired bridges. She had carried children. She had stood when others wanted her silent. But this was the first time she built something for herself. Not a roof, not a road, a name. She had come to this town with no papers, no family, no voice. And now, She had a name carved in wood and in memory. And every time someone knocked on that door, they didn't call for the girl. They asked, "Is Mara home?" And she really was. Chapter 9. The storm she held back. Not with weapons, with will. The wind began 2 nights before the storm hit. Long, moaning gusts that curled under doors and hissed through cracked shutters. The air smelled of iron and something older, like soil disturbed too. Suddenly, by morning, the sky turned an unnatural shade of pewter, thick and pressed low. The townspeople stood in their doorways, eyes narrowing, ears trained to the silence between the gusts. They had seen storms before. This one felt like it wanted to remember their names. And in the center of it all stood the girl they now called Mara. She didn't shout. She didn't raise a flag or pound her chest. She walked door to door, coat tied, tight eyes sharp. She pointed, nodded, placed hands on shoulders. She didn't ask for anything. She simply showed them what to do, and they listened. The men at the mill waited for her signal before latching the machinery doors. The children were herded into the old schoolhouse, now fortified with the very beams she'd mended weeks ago. The baker brought loaves. The butcher brought salt. The old man who never spoke unless spoken to gave her his lantern. When the wind came howling like a voice that had waited too long to scream, she stood in the center of the square, soaked through, sleeves rolled up, tying the final knots on a rope line between the tavern and the church. No one told her to stop. No one asked her to hide. They only followed, because they'd seen her fix things that couldn't be fixed. And tonight, it wasn't hammers or nails that held the town together. It was her hands, her steadiness, her calm. She moved like someone who had weathered worse, not just weathered, but life. Some say storms test your strength, but that night, the storm revealed theirs, and they realized most of it came from her. The winds did tear down one chimney, the east fence collapsed, but no one was lost, not a single injury, not a single soul left to search for. When the morning came, they gathered, in silence, when it cleared, wet and shaken, but whole, and one by one, eyes turned to her. She didn't bow, she didn't smile, she simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward her home, mud streaking the hem of her dress, braid clinging to her back like a metal dot. It wasn't just what she'd done, it was how she did it, with no weapon, no title, no voice, raised above the storm, only will. That was the night Mara became something more than the girl with nails. She became the spine of a town too used to bending, and no one ever again forgot where to look when the sky went dark. Chapter 10. The girl who never left, and the town that stayed because she did. Time didn't knock on her door. It just slipped in quietly, like it always does in places where days aren't counted but noticed by the way the tree bark deepens, by how the wind forgets old names. He had been gone for many years now, the man who once traded a sack of nails for a girl he didn't name. He left quietly, like everything else that had ever tried to leave her life. No grave was marked, just a stone at the back of the house, weathered and softened, with her handwriting etched into it, a name she never spoke aloud, but one everyone knew. But she stayed. Her hair, once the color of night, had faded to the same quiet gray as the clouds before spring rain. Her hands bore stories of iron, wood, and fire-scarred but gentle. She moved a little slower now, but her steps still made the same sound on the porch, steady as memory. Children born long after the storm called her by the names they invented: Nail Lady, Roof Mama, Mara, the Mender. None of them knew her real story, not in full. But they all knew the bridge she fixed still stood, the schoolhouse roof still held, and the crooked steps outside the church never again splintered after her hands straightened them. No one asked her to leave, no one expected her to. The town changed around her, as towns do. Houses became brighter, windows clearer, roads smoothed by generations who no longer knew what it meant to hide from storms with hands over ears. But in every structure, every beam, doorframe, hinge, there was a trace of her. She didn't lead meetings, she didn't make speeches, she never sat on the town council. But when a wall cracked or a well groaned, it was still her they called, not because she owed them but because she never turned away. Young girls followed her as she walked, some with hammers, others just with questions they never asked aloud. They watched how she listened to wood before nailing it, how she touched the ground before planting, how she paused before every repair, as if asking permission from the past. And still, she stayed, not out of duty, not from habit, but because staying was the only thing no one had ever demanded of her. And so she gave it freely. When the town celebrated its 50th year since the storm, they gathered in the square, not for a mayor or a priest, but for her. She didn't make a speech. She didn't even stand. She simply sat on the same bench where she once rested a sack of tools and looked around. There were children laughing on mended porches, families sleeping under roofs she once rebuilt, lovers carving initials into trees she had planted. She had never left, and the town hadn't either, because somehow, without ever raising her voice or asking for thanks, she had become the thing that held it together, not with nails, not with strength, but with presence. Solid, silent, and always there.